What's up, everybody? Welcome to Midweek Multiplied. My name is Cade Richards, and if you want to know what we're all about at the Lines for Christ, our mission statement is we exist to help UAFS students discover that they are designed for something, and we believe that that something is to follow Jesus, be changed by Jesus, and to live on mission with Jesus. I'm pretty pumped today, so as we get started, rather than hear me talk about the Word of God, you are going to encounter the Word of God directly yourself. So I want you guys in your small groups to flip over to the 8th book of the Bible. That's the book of Ruth, and I want you to read the entire book of Ruth yourself. It's only 4 chapters. I think it took me somewhere around 10 minutes. Probably should take you no more than 15 minutes. But right now I want you to read the book of Ruth, so pause this video and read it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. So after that story, I want to tell you a little story of my own. And it's a true story. So this story is about 2 brothers that were college students, very much like yourself. And they decided to take the command of God and the commands of God to pray and fast seriously. And so it wasn't extravagant. Basically, they just started doing this daily. They started praying together daily, and then they started fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, and they just made this a regular habit. And so they started doing this, these 2 brothers, and they invited a few of their close friends into this journey with them, this rhythm with them. And so, of course, like college students do, they didn't just gain all this great attention. There were other people that started making fun of them, and so they became known as the Holy Club. People were kind of poking fun at the things that they were doing, these spiritual rhythms that they were taking seriously, and to some people too seriously. And so they continued to do this, and this just kind of became what they did, the method that they used to follow God. And so as they did this, it became apparent to them that, hey, this isn't just about private spirituality. This isn't just about us. Our actions, our spirituality need to reflect and affect the people around us. And so it needs to change us. So they started to do things like take the commandment to visit prisoners seriously. They would go to local prison and visit people, and they would minister to the homeless in their city, and they would begin to tutor orphans in their city, and basically any way that they could see fit to alleviate suffering around them, they would do that. They just started taking fasting and praying seriously, and then ministering to the people around them seriously. So all of this seemed extremely insignificant and routine and mundane, these methods of following God, except for they attracted the attention of a young freshman named George. And George was drawn to their strange methods of following God. And eventually, the brothers ended up discipling this young guy named George, who later, in a really cool turn of events, ended up going to America and became an influential preacher. So turn into the book of Ruth. The very first line of the book says that in the days when the judges ruled. So what in the heck's going on? Honestly, we have the entire book of Judges. Why do we need another book set in the time of Judges called Ruth? So for some reason, the biblical writers thought that we needed these 4 chapters of this seemingly insignificant foreign woman named Ruth, that was going to help us somehow in our faith, in following God. So the question is for us, why in the world did they include this story of this foreign Moabite woman named Ruth? So first off, we have to address that she is from Moab, and Moab and the Moabites have a very gritty and dark history. So we see that through Lot's daughters in Genesis, through his daughter's incestuous relationships with him, Moab was born, and out of Moab comes the Moabites. So that was in Genesis, and then all the way in Numbers, go check out our video on Numbers, we see this king of the Moabites named Balak tries to call down curses on the Israelites as they're passing through the land of Moab. And so God has other plans through the prophet Balaam. Again, check out that video. So 2 terrible stories so far. And then in the book of Judges itself, we have King Eglon of the Moabites, who is assassinated in a pretty gruesome story by a judge named Ehud. So not too many great stories coming out of the Moabites, and they were known for worshiping this foreign or false god named Chemosh. There's kind of some different renditions of it, but basically even in worshiping him, they used child sacrifice, and so not much great coming out of Moab, according to the biblical narrative. So then we get this story of Naomi, and they're in Moab, and she needs to return to her own people, to the Israelite nation, and she has her husband has died and her 2 sons have died, and so they've passed away, and it's just her. It's just Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law who, their husbands have died, her sons. And she releases them. She says, you don't have to go back to my country with me. You're free, essentially. So Orpah, she takes off, and then we get this amazing couple sets of verses in chapter 1. And so I want you to see the first great thing in the Bible to come out of Moab. So I want you to read chapter 1, verses 16 and 17 with me. It says this. So Naomi says, just go ahead and go. But Ruth replies, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So you might have heard that before in marriage ceremonies, but that's where it comes from. This woman Naomi says, you guys are free. You don't have to go back to my land with me. Your husbands are dead. And then Ruth replies, no, where you go, I will go. This beautiful scriptures that say, I am loyal to you and I am loyal to your God. That's what I'm about, and that's what I'm going to do. So I want to mention here something kind of peculiar about the book of Ruth. God is not mentioned very much in this book. And actually, the narrator never mentions God doing anything directly. So you're like, what in the world? Why in the heck is there a book that doesn't mention God doing something directly in the Bible? Why is there this book that's not overt in talking about the actions of God? And so it's this really cool sort of literary device to show that maybe God is at work some other way. Maybe God is at work, and so I want you to clue in on some of the actions of these key characters here. And so as we move on, Naomi says, she meets Boaz, and you have the whole story leading up to her meeting Boaz and things. And Naomi says, you need to go present yourself to Boaz as basically that you're available to be married. And so go present yourself as a potential wife to Boaz. And so she goes in the middle of the night and she lays at Boaz's feet. So I want to pause here for a second. And I want to be honest with you guys about Scripture and some of the feelings that you're probably having, and address them just really point blank. So in Israel, first of all, we need to address this issue of what is going on with this whole kinsman redeemer thing. So in Israelite culture, basically, a widow, if she was childless, she had not produced a child, there was kind of a system in place for this. So it was twofold. So if there was a widow, to extend the family line, to produce children and extend the family name, that widow was supposed to be married to a close relative of her spouse that had passed away, of her husband that had passed away. So preferably a brother, but a close kinsman, a close relative she would be married to them. That was to extend the family name, to produce children. Yes, it was a patriarchal society. There's no getting around that. But also, because it was a patriarchal society, women did not have a lot of value outside of marriage. They were vulnerable economically, physically, and so this was a measure of protection so that they could extend the family name, yes, and produce children, but also that they could be protected and be a part of the family still. And so that being said, this was, through a kinsman redeemer, and you also see it called levirate marriage. This is addressed that they're still doing this even in Jesus' time. You can read about it in Mark chapter 12, verses 18 through 27. And so I'm going to just go point blank here. I'm sure there are a lot of girls and even guys out there that are not really enjoying the picture and the role that women had during this time period, during the book of Ruth, and it's probably starting to make you angry. It's probably starting to raise a lot of questions. We live in an egalitarian society for the most part, so what do we have to learn from this outdated society and this practice of levirate marriage and the book of Ruth? Like, why should I pay attention to all this? So God reveals himself to specific cultures at specific times in history. It's one of the coolest things I think about God, that he interacts with us at specific times and specific places, that he reveals himself to us. That being said, just because God reveals himself to specific times and specific cultures, it doesn't mean that he approves of all aspects of that specific culture. I think we've made a pretty good point so far that God works within human sinfulness and human depravity to accomplish his purposes. So if some of this culture and some of this story is like really setting you off, I think a very basic point that I want you to hear is that God uses sinful people, and those sinful people are even within sinful cultures that God does not completely approve of everything and every aspect of that culture. He uses people and cultures to accomplish his redemptive purposes. And I hope that you see that throughout. The Bible itself is very honest about that. And so if this bothers you, I hope that you see that. So as we move through this, I want you to look at Ruth. Her devotion and her loyalty to Naomi led to this moment with Boaz, and I want you to see what happens here. So in chapter 3, let me get on over there. In chapter 3, verse 9, she makes her intentions pretty clear, and it takes a little bit of decoding here, but she says, or she presents herself to Boaz as available, essentially. And he says, "Who are you?" She says, "I'm your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." So essentially she's saying, spread your garment over me. That had connotations of protection. She's essentially saying to Boaz, like making her intentions extremely clear, she says, redeem me. Like, you are my redeemer. I need you to redeem me. Help me. Protect me. And so in the climax of this narrative, he does. Boaz does. He follows through with his commitments and responsibilities, and he says yes, essentially. Boaz says yes. And so I want you to hear this through this seemingly insignificant local wedding of these two people here, a Moabite and an Israelite. God does something extremely significant. So, Ruth, she was not born a Hebrew, and she felt no part of God's story. God had been using the Israelites to advance his purposes and his mission in the world. But then enters this foreign, alien Ruth, this stranger to this land. And in Ruth chapter 4, verse 17, she has a baby. Ruth has a child. And some of the women that are there with the child and with Naomi, her mother-in-law, they say this. The women there said, Naomi, by way of Ruth, has a son. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so if you want to flip over to Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, there's a genealogy of Jesus. And in that genealogy, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, it's really a mirror of this verse. It says, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, there's Rahab again, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. I hope that you're getting excited. I hope that if you followed along and if you see what I'm saying here, it's amazing. So the solution to all this chaos in the book of Judges was a king. But it took Ruth's small steps of faithfulness to get to that king. The biblical writer wanted us to know that through this woman's mundane acts of faithfulness, her everyday faithfulness, comes a king that breaks the cycle of chaos for an entire nation. That this woman is the great-grandmother of King David. Is that not amazing? That this woman is the great-grandmother of King David, this man that's going to unite an entire nation. And even more than that, that this woman, as we see in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, she was the ancestor of David, but she was also the ancestor of Jesus. And so this nobody is essential in telling the story of God's ways among us, that God was working through the faithfulness and the simple acts of human beings. That's how God was present and how God was at work in this chaos, in this story. One of the things that is the hardest for guys like me is to basically figure out how to show people that I'm teaching that this text has relevance for their life, to get people to feel the text. And I feel like my job is extremely easy today. So we have this book of Judges, and Ruth is set in the time of Judges, and it's just chaos. And I don't feel like I have to do a lot of hard work to get you to understand that we are also in a time of chaos in our society, in our nation right now. So for me, it's real simple, just looking through the headlines, like, you have Republicans and Democrats, and it's just chaos. If you fall into one camp or the other, then you have to believe that the other half of the country is just complete idiots. And are we stuck in this cycle where there's going to be a Republican candidate elected, and then it's going to be terrible for half of the country for 4 years, and then we're going to elect a Democratic president, and then the other half of the country is going to be really mad for 4 years, and the whole time we're just teetering on the brink of social upheaval and collapse? Are we doomed to repeat that cycle of chaos over and over again? The same with racial injustice. Martin Luther King has come, an incredible leader, a man exposing racial injustice and fighting it, and he led a movement. But here we are in 2020 still dealing with racial tensions. And it's like, are we stuck in this cycle where we're never going to figure it out? We're never going to solve it as a nation, as a society. And it's highlighted by things like coronavirus, the economic downturn. It's just chaos. Chaos. Is there hope? And then bringing it from a national level down to the UAFS level. I look at things like depression. I mean, if we really think about depression and suicide, I mentioned these things a lot, but think about it. Somebody on our campus thinks that it is better to end their life than to just keep on living the way that they're living. And we have so much awareness. We have so much people like me and other advocates in society talking about it to raise awareness. And yet people are still depressed and people are still killing themselves at alarming rates. It's not getting any better. Are we doomed to this cycle of chaos? The same with injustices like rape on college campuses, even at UAFS. I mean, we have shed so much light. We've held so many seminars, and it's like, what are we to do? There's documentaries out like The Hunting Grounds that have shed light on how bad the situation is on college campuses, and yet we are still in this cycle of chaos. So what's the answer? And you're like, Cade, you told us last week the book of Judges anticipates a king, and just like that, my life anticipates a king. Your life anticipates a king to still the chaos. So what else do we need to know? What is Ruth trying to say to this? What is the book of Ruth trying to say? What else do we need to know on how to deal with chaos? We have the book of Judges. Why do we need the book of Ruth? Those two brothers were two guys named Charles and John Wesley. They founded the Holy Club at Oxford University. This Holy Club had another nickname that actually stuck. So they got mocked being called the Holy Club, but really what they came to be known were the Methodists, and they started the Methodist movement, something that you may be familiar with on church signs, or maybe you have some connection with the Methodist Church. That young man, George, that they influenced, wasn't just a no-namer George. They attracted and discipled this guy named George Whitefield, who became one of the most influential preachers to ever live. He was the voice that fanned the flame of the Great Awakening in America. And he would preach to crowds of over 20,000 people, even 30,000 people, during this time of spiritual awakening in America. And what we're talking about is revival. We're talking about revival. That God used this personal devotion and loyalty, these small acts of John Wesley, of Charles Wesley, to fan the flames of a movement. This started in November of 1729. John Wesley was later quoted about this. He said it's the Wesleyan movement, the Methodist movement started with 4 college students praying in a room in November of 1729. And it was those 4 college students praying in a room that led to a spiritual awakening of a nation. So it's not just your personal life that needs a king. It's whole cultures that need a king. It's our culture that needs a king. It's the world that needs a king to stop the cycle of chaos. We need revival. I hope that you feel that. The individual chaos is stilled by a king, but societal chaos is also stilled by a king. That God uses insignificant individuals to do extremely significant things. That Ruth, her story shows us that simple acts of loyalty, simple acts of devotion to God lead to incredible things. Ruth was the ancestor, this Moabite foreign woman. She was the ancestor to Emmanuel, to Jesus. That's God. God with us came from her line. The Great Awakening happened because God used a very small group of college students praying in a room. Just some people decided to get together regularly and pray. Revival starts there. Revival starts with everyday faithfulness like Ruth's. So if you are intrigued by this, if this is capturing you, man, we have prayer groups. There's a guys' prayer group that meets every single week. If you are interested in praying, get together with your small group and commit yourself to regular prayer. Because big things happen with everyday faithfulness. If you want to try your hand at fasting, talk to your small group leaders. They are going to be engaging in fast throughout this semester. And I'm sure they would love if you joined us, and they would invite you into that with them if you want to practice fasting and discipleship. Man, George Whitefield came because he was discipled by some people, just some everyday faithful people. John Wesley, Charles Wesley. I would encourage you, think seriously about starting these disciplines of prayer, fasting, and discipleship, even if discipleship is just getting into a discipling relationship with one of your small group leaders. So yes, we should pray for ourselves. But man, this is bigger than that. It's bigger than you individually. I want you to pray for your campus, pray for our nation, pray for the world. And I want us to pray, and I think the lack of prayer in our Christian culture is because we don't expect God to do anything. But man, if we begin to take seriously these everyday acts of prayer, revival happens. So for us, man, it's not about us being good. It's not about our stories. It's not about God working through us so we can get the glory. This isn't our story. We have to get away from being so egocentric. It's all about us. This great thing happened through me. We have got to squash that. I'm talking to you, Christians. This story really isn't about Ruth. The story's about God. This is God's story. Ruth is a supporting player in God's story. If you think about Ruth had a baby, and it wasn't even a cool name baby. His name's Obed. That's a terrible name. So Ruth had a baby and then died. That was her story. That's all that she saw. Yes, she was redeemed by Boaz. But then she had a baby, and then she passed away later, and that's all she saw. It wasn't about her. And if this story is about Ruth, it's a really lame story. But if we focus in on God, we see how good God is. We see that God is revealing himself in the middle of all this chaos, how he works, how much he loves us, how much he wants to see order restored within the chaos and us come back to him. Man, this is about everyday faithfulness. And bonus point here, I can't teach this lesson without mentioning this. If you didn't like the position that Ruth was in, having to come to Boaz and say, please save me, redeem me, that this woman, it's kind of depicted maybe in your mind as this woman squabbling up to this guy and saying, please save me, I'm nothing without you. We are all in that same position. That is the Christian gospel. Essentially, we have got to adopt the mentality of Ruth. That Ruth was this alien, this stranger in a foreign land. She was a foreigner coming to the Israel nation, to the nation of Israel. And basically, it took a kinsman redeemer to bring her into God's chosen people. It took Boaz accepting her, bringing her into this nation, into this family. And I hope that you see that we are exactly the same way. Because of our sin, we are strangers and foreigners to God. And it's even more intense language used in the book of Romans. It says that we are enemies of God because of our sin. And we have no place in God's family without a kinsman redeemer. And so I hope that you're connecting the dots, that Jesus is King, but he is also our kinsman redeemer. He is the one that vouches for us. He is the one that spreads his garment over us, that protects us. So we have to come to him and say, protect us, save us, redeem us, God. And just like Boaz, he says, yes, I will be your kinsman redeemer. And he adopts us into his family in the same way that Boaz adopts Ruth into the family of God. If you're wondering how all that works out, why your sin disqualifies you from being in the family of God, please talk to your small group leader. But for tonight, I want to encourage you. I want to ask you and implore you to take seriously your daily faithfulness. That's where revival starts, with prayer and fasting and discipleship. And I know I've talked to a lot of your small group leaders that college students deal so heavily with discipline. But I'm asking you to have a serious conversation about these things. Are we going to take seriously that the power of prayer is real? We're not just doing some mindfulness exercise. We're not just doing this prayer because, it feels good and we don't want to be sinful, and if you pray, you're a better Christian. No, we're talking to the creator of the universe and asking him to use power, real power, to change things in the present. Are we going to take seriously? Do we actually believe that? Do we believe that praying to Him will change our situations?